Start adding that we co-curated the show with Luc. It was a real kind of fusion, something that we were very close together and that we worked for 2 years. And I thank a lot the two writers. So maybe you can start, Jarrett, after seeing the works in flesh, because that was, as usual, we have to write before to see the works in flesh sometimes.
Ah. Well, I think that predicament that you started with is one that I grappled with within the text. Because very often curators, people who write about art, are forced into a position where they have to write about paintings that they're not necessarily expected to see in person. And it's sort of an obstinate old school position that I have adopted, that I would never write about a painting that I haven't seen. And so, nevertheless, you can see a painting, you work from your notes and from reproductions, and then when you see this whole, the exhibition of paintings has a purpose, and that's to look at the paintings as physical objects in space, and that procession makes an argument. And so I guess that more than making a statement about that, I want to put on the table a question that I have, which is I felt that in the decisions that were made in this collaboration between the space and the decades of paintings, was that the show is in one sense ostentatiously beautiful, very, very, very beautiful. And I feel like beauty in Luc Tuymans' world rarely is delivered without a lot of antagonism nested inside of it. So I want to start maybe with that question about the relationship between the role of antagonism and its relationship to beauty in the paintings.
Luc?
Oh, yes, right. Well, yeah, I expected this question in a way. No, of course there is a great deal of antagonism in the work anyhow, basically. But in this case it was rather particular. I mean, there is also the element of revenge to begin with. And then is of course Venice, which is a very specific environment. And Palazzo is also even more a specific environment. And I thought it was very important to actually make a show that sort of like became rather personal in a way, if you're talking about antagonism. And also not to make a linear show. So not a show that is a retrospective, although people may see it as a retrospective, it is not. I mean, a great deal of the work is very recent work. Now, if you work on a project like that for 2 years, you could easily overthink it. So I asked all the works of Francois Pinault in the show so we can put them out gradually, so that I could still deliver new work, so it will not be boring for myself, for example. I mean, also, the funny thing is I've been shitting on the French for ages, and then it turns out that my biggest collector is French. So, in a sense, all these things are in itself antagonistic, but the show itself is also a show which is made not for the people that bought the work, not for the people that own the work, not for the people that were born in a palazzo, which is rather interesting, and it's a show for tourists, but not in a pejorative way, in a bad way, in a good way. I mean, in a sense that you make something pictorial. The pictoriality of it was the main issue of this show. Therefore, no Condoleezza Rice, no Moaniki Toko. By their absence, the people who are informed will ask, where are these fucking paintings? They're not in the show. So they will be there anyway, for the people who are informed. The ones that are not, it is a total blank new experience. Born out of the idea of, voyeurism in a way. You come to this city because it's so luxurious, And then, of course, you want to go to a palazzo. And then you go into palazzo, and then you see this. Also, not to make a work that goes against the space, but in accordance with the space and reacts on it. Of course, I also saw the show of Damien Hirst, which I didn't dislike, by the way. A lot of people did, but I didn't. I mean, you shouldn't have done the Punta del Dogano, that's too much. But here, in the Palazzo Grassi, with the big sculpture, it sort of functioned. So therefore, it also ignited in me the idea to make something that reversed this element of monumentality and that's how actually the mosaic came about. So, and already the encasement of the old painting that was derived from the head of spear, but turned out to be more like a doll-like figure, encased in the wall. From the very first start, you get the intention of the show. And the intention is, of course, beauty, but it's a rather perverse one. So that's rather antagonistic.
Marc, you want to add something?
I had this chance to do a show some years ago with Luc in Lille, in the Museum of Modern Art in Lille. So we had a lot of discussion doing this show. And for me, when I looked at this show, I have the memories of our whole discussion. And at the beginning, I was thinking that this show was about light, about silence, or about memories.
Go ahead.
But now I think it's something more about how you do a painting. For me, this show is like a journey. When you go through all these rooms, looking to the paintings, it's like a journey inside your work.
Yeah, the one interesting thing, of course, is, and that was kind of a shock for myself, is some of the works in this show are close to 40 years old. So that means oil paint takes about 25 years to really be completely dry. I said that yesterday. And therefore, the colors go inside. So they become, I mean, they sort of retrieve themselves from the surface. So now, as a spectator, and even myself, I have the opportunity to really see the aging process and the difference. And that was actually a surplus. That was actually quite nice. Because the show is also about detachment. I'm getting a bit older now. So in that sense, like I always said, I always wanted to be completely demented and look at my work, it's like somebody completely stupid, and then see what it brings. So this, not that it comes close to that, but I mean, that idea, as you say, is a process, is very much put to an edgy position in this show, because the choice that Caroline and I made was very personal, and the juxtapositions also. And so every space in itself sort of turns around. The fact that if you see the first floor of the Palazzo Grassi, you have the ceilings, so it's still ground. Then you go in and it becomes like more boxed in, like a white cube. So downstairs, there's the light with the green paintings that give out to the front. Upstairs, there's the darkness with the dark painting and the ceiling that is a bit lower. So these were very sort of conscious and deliberate moves. Also the encasing of the first painting and the encasing of the back of the building, where they opened this one space where the Heydrich painting falls in. Both, of course, having to do with a specific trajectory in history, which I don't emphasize on, but still it's one of the building blocks.
May I add that at the beginning we had started thinking about light, the light as a subject for the show, but it grew in a, on my point of view, quite deeper, with a lot of layers, including relationship with different kind of way to paint, and you give a lot of keys, and we keep in the show some references, like of course Cézanne, but William Robertson. There's some layers to history and to history of art too, which is always in your work, I think.
Yeah, that's just genetical. That's where I come from. I mean, so I mean, in a sense, no. There is, of course, yeah. If you work with painting, you cannot get away from the tradition of painting, in a sense, and the way that you. I mean, it's also strange that when a painter is interviewed, there is always this idea that there's always the expectation that there's a huge background. more than with any other art form, so to speak, which is correct. I mean, because it is actually one of the very first concepts or visual concepts that we can think of. So in a sense, it goes all the way back. So no, yeah, all these references should be there, I think.
I want to pick up on something that Marc started to bring up is also implicit in his piece for the catalogue, which is a very elegant and thorough situation of Luc's work in relationship to the history of photography. And when you started to talk about memory, when we look at photographs, they have embedded within them a very specific relationship both to memory but also to reality. And when we look at paintings, we carry with us very different associations to both memory and reality. And I feel like in a lot of the work, the mechanism has been to leverage the one thing against the other, but that has changed over time, what the leveraging does and to what effect. And so I would just love to know more about that transition between this kind of bigger concepts, which might be more like content rather than the use of photographs per se, which seems to be more like subject matter, but not necessarily the point.
Yeah, also, first of all, I said this also yesterday, I'm going to say it again. So I'm actually a child of a television generation, so which means a huge amount of imagery, but transmitted imagery, which is something different than photographs. And moving imagery also, which I think is interesting. The element of the paused element of the imagery, the frozen element, the taken element, the appropriation within that situation is important. And also the fact that I, of course, stopped painting because I thought it was getting too close, too tormented, too existential, and then worked with film. And then after the whole adventure with film, the lens provided me with the necessary distance in order to come, for example, to, there's quite some of the page, not all, but the diagnostical view, which is in this corridor, which is like a fridge you're looking at. So where you for the first time see that I was not interested in the psychology of the portrait. On the contrary, I was interested about the naturalism within it, by which you actually miss the real. So this is how it comes rather not a comment on photography. I mean, the comment on photography was important for people like V.S. Selmans, Richter, and even Andy Warhol, in a sense, because the idea also that with Andy Warhol, black is important, so the authority of print, and of course Richter created a whole generation of new German photographers, basically, Thomas Ruf, Struth, and what you can think of. So his idea changed that in a way. That was not my impelling interest, in a sense. Also, from a painterly point of view, that was not my interest, because I think the painterly interests go further back in terms of what the stroke does, in terms of what the work does now, how it has evaporated also to a point. With the three catalogue resonates, it was interesting to see that in the beginning, it was a positioning and largely trying to figure out, and actually the very first paintings I made were actually based on things that I filmed, but they were decoupage drawings on little pieces of paper, which I wanted to enlarge because I wanted to paint a drawing, which is very difficult because a painted line is not a drawn line. The fact that that worked was like sort of revelation to me. From this harshness, also to very first make the backdrop, come from the backdrop to the front, which I didn't do in the beginning. And actually, the beginning was very gestural, non-formal, and colorful. So going against your own aesthetic and then sparsing it out. So it had a sort of a graphic element to it, which then, through time, actually evaporates. And I think that is what you actually beautifully can see in this show. And now, if we're talking about light and its consensus, we're talking about where I come from, tonality, which means depth. So depth in the sense that you don't have a raw color, you have a mixed tone. You have a temperature, you have warmth, you have cool. And here in Venice, it's kind of interesting because it's not my town. And the light is also kind of completely different. So when we were actually, Caroline and I, installing the show, I started to look at the work completely differently because we have a completely different light, especially on the first floor. Not so much on the second, but especially the first floor was like the three paintings of the murky waters really have never had such visibility as they have now, for example. So that's kind of interesting.
But before you used a lot Polaroid. which with specific color, like the three big square painting with this specific yellow-green colors.
The murky waters, you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Now you use more an iPhone. This is a gap in your work or not?
Yeah, you're a child of your contemporaneity. So in a sense, I mean, to give you an idea, when I won the Max Beckmann Professor's Prize a couple of years ago in the Städel in Frankfurt, I had to make a show out of the collection. But also they asked me to put one of my paintings in the museum. So I put it in the space that I remember when I visited for the first time the Städel, where I saw the painting of Fernand Knopf and paintings of Max Liebermann. And it was one of the two paintings that were actually a diptych, but one was in Shanghai at the point, and the other one I can show in Frankfurt, which was against the day. So it was a guy shoveling in my garden against a tree, which is kind of could be the 19th century, right? But once it was hung, the light was digital. The light and the shadow, the contrast, everything was different. So even I didn't really realize that. So these things crawl into the situation.
One thing that the totality of the show really drove home for me is that the paintings that you're talking about, the murky water paintings, which were made from Polaroids, those were relatively recent paintings. Those are just from a few years ago. And that the one, for instance, the digital image does not displace the photographic image, which does not displace the painting. You know, it's not like, well, now I've got an iPhone, I don't need to work from photographs anymore. And by bringing them all together, I felt like they're looking at these paintings, the media information that they were extrapolated from is much more clear to see how, and the way that you grappled with that in painting has really changed. Like, for instance, I really loved seeing the evolution of the brushstroke in the painting that almost feels like its descriptive capacity was shattered as you continued to paint. Whereas now you never, if you have an outline of something, you would never just draw a brushstroke that correlates with the pictorial information of an edge. It would like be little bits, like broken into bits. And some of the earliest paintings, which I think you were referring to as more graphic, there are places where they're more in alignment, as you would think of in traditional painting.
No, that is completely correct. I mean, that also, in a way, reverberates to the attention span, I think. And it's kind of interesting how that's why I also said that you cannot go back in painting. It's impossible, which is the beauty of it in a sense also. And maybe this can be a mistake, but on the other hand, it is like the habits is really important. So, and it should be true to the matter. I mean, it should be, in that sign, actually timely also. I think that's interesting.
To continue, I think even if we didn't put any of the more direct kind of paintings, the period, the question around colonialism or some portraits of power people, let's put it this way, there's I mean, more I see the show, I love to go and see it again and again. There's those obsession with that dark part of ourselves. You spoke about a perverse beauty when we opened the show. And there's also that layer that you give us, to the public, all the tools to keep our own distance, critical distance. There's a lot of ways to look at the paintings, and you give even ways to look at it, the subject, and the way it's made. And that's something I discovered when we installed, which I didn't have capture before.
Yeah, of course. I mean, although, I made the preparations on the SketchUp, which was rather precise, and even a little film, but then the corners go like this. So once you're in the real space, the paintings became twice as big. And of course, the light, which was the biggest surprise of all. And still, it's physically different. I mean, so that's why you have to do a show like that. And also what Jarrett said, I mean, I understand it. I mean, one shouldn't write about a painting when one hasn't seen it. I mean, there's been dissertations, a ton of dissertations of people who do a PhD who would never actually seen a work of mine and don't have a problem with it either, by the way. So in a sense, that also exponentially shows you how important the physicality is. And I think here it came out in, I mean, I'm also kind of happy with the show. It's fine, it's great.
To go back to the question of antagonism, I felt like when you first started painting, and for a lot of your career, the question to paint itself was, and to paint with quote unquote representationally or with figures, was an antagonistic position. It was like a contrary, like there was a justification of like why paint, and I think you addressed that conceptually with a lot of force. But now the culture is almost like a victory lap of figurative painting, as though like that was never a problem and we all love it and it's everywhere. And so it seems to me like the context is almost inverted from when you first started making these paintings. I don't know if how you feel about that.
Well, I mean, when I did my very first show in a gallery, or a so-called gallery, was in '88, and it was actually an artist friend who had a space that actually now stopped, but after 30 years, who actually mostly showed post-conceptual work. So of course this was, well anyway, nobody wanted to show the work anyway. I mean, I did about 86 galleries in Germany, even with a dog, and it didn't work. So eventually I ended up there. That was the very first show in my hometown also. I was then, I think, 32 or so, in '88. And of course people said, they're not paintings, they're conceptual images. Then I also made a point to give, I mean, because I hated the artist that would be standing in the corner and then once in a while say something intelligent. I don't, this sort of mythological thing, I don't like that. So I gave all the source material, which was great, because then the journalists at least knew what to write. And then later on they got mad at me because they said, if Tuymans doesn't talk about the work, we can't write about it. So yeah, it's never good, you know? So in a sense, and this is the same story, ridiculous story about painting is dead or alive. It's just a mock-up. It's also a complete misunderstanding of Duchamp, which is a great artist, by the way. And so in that sense, all this misunderstanding is in a laborious sort of metonymy that went into a discord that rotated on itself. I think every medium in art is specific, and I happen to like to paint. I mean, physically, I like to do it. I mean, that's why I don't work with assistants. I need the touch. I need this perversity of that touch. And if I don't like to do that anymore, then I probably have to stop. I mean, I also don't want to excuse myself. I mean, a carpenter who likes to carpenter, or a guy who likes to make shoes, or what the fuck ever, or a sportsman, they don't have to fucking excuse themselves, so why should I? So in that sense, no, that was not the problem. But nevertheless, it were different times. So I came up with the idea, which was rather stupid and regressive, was like, let's make an authentic falsification. Let's make paintings that, if you look at them, they could have been made 30 years ago. This was also the first critique from the French, mostly Paris, of course, which has nothing to do with France, but nevertheless. So the first time they were showed, they said, they're actually paintings from the flea market. The other thing I know was when the first American show at David Swerner, there was this American couple that came out of LA and said, is this some kind of folk art? Because the paintings were small. So in that sense, we went through this whole, there was also a critique once in the New York Times that said, then that was the first critique ever, the deliberate humility, which means the guy is putting himself on the position of outsider art for not to be criticized. And of course, I came from Europe, so I mean, I didn't really understand the United States yet at that point. So that was funny.
But in your last show at Zenoix Gallery, you did some details of your own painting.
That was at Frank's gallery, yeah. Frank's gallery, yeah. That's interesting, because I tried to this came about because I had to show the Menil collection, and then with only portraits, and I sort of, with my iPhone, photographed them and cropped them differently. I think it's kind of interesting. So, and this was also the anniversary show with Frank, so about 25 years of working together. So I wanted to have a reminiscence, and I recreated these portraits, which was actually very difficult, I have to say. Very difficult, yeah.
You are difficult to paint. You are difficult to paint to copy.
No, no, the Chinese do it brilliantly. I mean, really, believe me.
I have a question for a painting world question, which is it's very overdetermined to show paintings in Venice because we have Titian and we have Tintoretto, and the interest for me about Titian in relationship to your work is within Western art history, he basically invented the touch of the painter as we know it in painting. He worked without assistance, he worked directly on the canvas without preliminary drawings, the first time that that really happened. And so I wondered, like, when you were approaching this show in Venice in particular, how you were thinking about that painting history.
Well, first of all, I admire Titian because he's one of the greatest painters, and I also admire Tintoretto. So it's an honor, in a sense, to be in this city where these people were generated. But then, of course, also I come from a place where we have Jan van Eyck.
Right.
And that's where, of course, Tintoretto and Leonardo da Vinci and whatever go fuck themselves. So it's not going to work. So, I also come from Antwerp. So what's the problem?
But the problem of the hand and the touch in your painting is much closer a confrontation and undoing of a kind of story coming out of Titian than it is Jan van Eyck.
Yeah, of course. No, Van Eyck was traumatizing from the start. I saw that when I was 8, and I said, forget it. We cannot topple this. The guy also had a fantastic motto, you know, if I can, which means I'm big on humility, but behind that are the most gigantic ambitions, which was true. And so forget it. You can't fight it. I mean, if you blow up a face of Van Eyck the size of a palazzo, it's still there. You know, it breathes in your neck. So it is. Yeah, it's really. So after that, you become a dilettante. I mean, that's what most art and artists became, in a sense.
Difficult to answer.
Is it something that either of you thought
Maybe
about?
name a French painter or something.
Ooh.
There's one that you quote, which is Cézanne on the show, but it's Courbet.
Courbet, I love. Courbet is so fucking aggressive, and so yeah, it's one of the most aggressive. It's a pity they didn't continue that line actually, that they interrupted it. But no, like Manet, and especially Courbet, which is the landscapes who are so ardent of acidity. I think it's great. Yeah.
And the wave.
Huh?
It's a very physical painting.
Also, but it also has the reminiscence of Goya in it, to a very weird point. Yeah.
Well, in the show, some works like the first Issei Sakawa with the hat, the colonel hat, was a big shock for me, knowing that you do every painting in one day. Well, I guess you all know the layers, all the layers, and the image comes with the painting. For me, it's very Goya, and it's something I could not see on the computer. As much as there, and it's an example of one of the painting in for all of us. There's a kind of you bring us to how to look at a painting in a way. There's something very generous on that way, and the subject is quite heavy. We didn't mention any of the subject here yet, but the heaviness of what is between Nazi, cannibalism, death, made me look at the world in a more dystopic way than you. We can keep still utopic, because you leave the people to understand as they wish all the works. So, for example, for me, the cook became a butcher, not a cook at all. And the morning sun became an atomic bomb, which is very different for you, because there's a kind of progression with a lot of subjects that we are daily confronted in our days too, and that you were so much a visionary that I was super impressed by the idea of fake or true, which is all over the show.
I'm glad you brought up that Issei Sagawa painting because I tried to write about it for a lot of the work that I was doing for this essay in the catalog. I really grappled with those paintings. For those that don't know, I mean, to me, Luc is the great philosopher of images of our time, and the work is becoming more and more impassioned and important as the role of images in our lives change even more rapidly, become more intense, the structures of control become more suffocating. And with that painting in particular, this is a very strange mask-like painting. As Caroline said, the painting itself is a kind of brava of bruise-colored strokes that make this very strange visage, which is a kind of mask, and it's a picture of a serial killer as a child. And I went really deep into it. Like, I read his memoir. He basically has had this through...
He's still alive, actually.
He's still alive. Through a legal fluke, he lives in Japan, and he makes a living basically by selling the story of his murder to people who are interested in this kind of death fetishism. And it really got so dark, I felt like I couldn't deal with writing about it in a way that didn't completely take over the story of the painting. And what's impressive about the physical reality of the painting is that the painting itself can hold its own. But in a text with a reproduction, it's like this, it's too sensational. And I don't know, you painted that painting multiple times, or you did multiple versions of him.
Well, here in the show, there's 2 portraits of Isegawa.
So what is it about that subject matter that you wanted to stick with?
Well, first of all, the cannibalism, which I think is an interesting cultural point of view as a point of departure, and also the fact that the guy is so full of himself. Which
Also, it happened. He was a student in Paris, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
at the Sorbonne.
At the Sorbonne.
yeah, but actually, what happened is that he actually lured a Dutch co-student into his apartment, killed her, and then tried to eat her, and then was caught with the remainders of the girl in 2 suitcases in Bois Boulogne. And the French at that point didn't know what to do because the guy was Japanese, so they had to extradite him, and he was from a wealthy family, so he disappeared for a couple of months and then cropped up. He was rather popular in Japan because it was, of course, long, tall, white, blonde women. So it was the Japanese themselves were not endangered species. So, but lately he actually could go to the other side. So I saw this whole documentary about the guy, and I thought it was insane. The whole proposition and the way he fetishized and talked about it. And in that sense, also, the images it produced were rather pictorial. I mean, because the one we're talking about is actually how they try to psychologically explain why the guy did it. And so it was because him and his brother, they had an older brother, and this is where the masked image comes from, that sort of dressed up these kids and tried to always threatened them to put them in a pot of boiling water and he would eat them. Mm-hmm. So this, in accordance with the Japanese society full of inhibitions, it's rather interesting. So.
Well, the other thing I was thinking about, the image of him as a child wearing a mask, is that psychoanalytically, so often in order to make sense of someone's actions, you look back into childhood for explanations, and you look back in the childhood and nothing's there. It all falls apart. There's no making sense of it. And I thought that was, within your work, which is suffused with violence. In one interview, I'm sure this is taken out of context, you said that violence is the only structure underlying your work. You never would show the image of the half-eaten girl, which there are images of, right? The images that you choose are so they're positioned at you like a knife at the throat, but not with violence itself, with the implication of violence.
No, because I always had a grave respect for Fritz Lang, who never did that. I mean, if you think back to Eine Stadt sucht einen Mörder, the beginning of the movie, you hear somebody whistling, you hear a mother crying out to the girl, you see the balloon spatting out, and you hear a scream, so you know it happened. Same in White Heat with the coffee can, and then you hear the cry, and Lee Marvin just threw the boiling coffee on the face of his girlfriend. I think that's more potent. The same with the gas chamber, where you don't see the bodies, you just see the empty space. So it's the residue that actually interests me, because I think that is also the element where you pause the imagery and your thought, and also the fact where you create this element of distance which has no more moral zone where you can cope with. It becomes immoral to a point. I think that's the important thing, and that's maybe where the cannibalism was so fascinating for me. Yeah.
Or it's like for the halo painting. It's like the story of the halo painting.
Yeah.
You are late. You are. On vient toujours après l'histoire. On est toujours en retard.
We're always delayed. We always come after what history made. We always need to look back to understand.
And this is, of course, a joke, this whole series of the yellow paints, of which I only show one. And deliberately on that spot, when you come out of the darkened room, I think it's quite interesting because your retina will take the dark with you and then go into this technicolor image. This was just made because I remembered something. I mean, I still remember when we didn't have a television also as a kid. And also when we got the first color television, I also remember that. And I remember seeing this film, which is kind of a stupid movie with George Saunders, and one of the first movies in the 40s who sort of idolized, at the same time also portrayed the artist as this egoistic, you know, like self-indulgent pig, but in the end is actually absolved because of the work, you know. And this is the end of the movie. The movie is stupid, it's in black and white. And at the end, there is this German, I mean, this doctor with a thick German accent who comes into the village, and the artist has already dead, his indigenous woman is rolling in the sand, and then he goes into the hut, and that's all color. And then you see this sort of kitschy paintings that remind you of Gauguin. So I thought that was funny. So in that sense, that is that type of aha-erlebnis with all his facets was kind of interesting. So that's why. And of course you are belated, and especially when it comes to a medium like painting is already belated in a sense. And like the fact that I painted like these murky waters far later. There's also watercolors that exist of it, there's tapestry that is based on it. It's because they become relevant at a certain point. They're also, like in the data bank, they're stuck here and they come back.
I had the good fortune of seeing a show that Luc organized on the topic of the Baroque in Antwerp last year. And I've been thinking about it a lot, and I feel like that's part of your prescience as a kind of antenna of what's going on in the world, because with a number of my friends, the art of the Counter-Reformation has become so, it just feels vitally relevant. And so what is in operation in those paintings like Caravaggio or whatever? It's like the invention of a new pictorial logic in which you can use images to solicit a level of emotion and belief to kind of bring people back into the thrall and the control of the church, rather than, you know, the threat of Protestantism. And so I think in terms of power, I mean, is that how you think about Caravaggio, or like what is it that has been interesting to you about the Baroque now?
First of all, I was not really interested into the Baroque, I mean, as such. But they asked me to do this show because the American curator fell off and they didn't know what to do. So I became actually some kind of like the plumber in a sense. And out of the top of my head, I said, okay, fine. I'll get the 5-car stud, which is in the Prada Foundation, and I know these people. And I said to the other guy of the Museum of Fine Arts, because actually the Baroque year was because of the fact that the museum, that's still sort of like not yet finished, should have been finished in its new form, but wasn't. So that already from the start, it was like a lost case. So, and I said to the director of the Museum of Fine Arts, get me the Calafret of Caravaggio, you know, the last self-portrait, and in between of that, I will make a show about contemporary art. So that was the idea. But what really, and of course, that particular painting we didn't get. We got 2 other Caravaggios, but we really got it at the end in the Prada Foundation. And that's one of my most preferred paintings, because I mean, of course, I come out of the city where Rubens was born. So Rubens is phenomenal as an artist. He was never forgotten. He was also a sort of, I mean, he was a firm. He was the very first filmmaker. He was the very first Cecil B. DeMille. He came actually on the spot and the right time when everything was destroyed just because of the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation, and said, Rubens is not made for your home. You have to see it from a very far distance. I don't even think that anybody painted that large a scale of a painting as Rubens did, with the concentric eye of the Baroque, I mean, in a sense. But very important for Velázquez also. He stayed at the court, changed the entire way Velázquez painted, for example. So it's the very first filmmaker, actually. Caravaggio is that too, but it's a B production. It's another production. He was on the run. He was forgotten for for 200 years at least. And if you look at this imagery, of course, we will tend to go much more to Caravaggio, to the film noir, so to speak, than actually the mythological proposition of the grandeur of Rubens, in a sense.
But also, to go to this question of belatedness, Caravaggio always puts you in the exact moment when it's happening. It's that's the Baroque moment where it's like the boy's being...
No, that's an Italian moment. Don't forget that. You know, there's a big difference between the way the Flemish paint and the Italians. So, and you can actually see that literally in the show where you had Jacob Jordaens, because we, of course, didn't get the real good Rubens we needed. No, that's stupid, but anyway. And then, of course, this beautiful painting of Caravaggio. The Italians go from black to the light. The Flemish go from light to the dark. It's a completely different process of visualization, and this, of course, in the idea of the Baroque with the concentric eye. And it's like where the most light falls, there is the less material in the Flemish painting. With the Italians, it is the opposite. This was also a shock when I was in a show in the Tate Modern, and next to me was one of my heroes, which was Edward Hopper. To see Morning Sun and to see how thick he painted where the light fell, then you can see that he actually comes from an illustrational proposition within the visual, which was rather interesting.
I will just say for everyone that the 5 cars you're speaking about is a work by Kinholz, which has been shown and owned by the Prada Foundation in Milano. And it's about the killing of a black guy by the Ku Klux Klan people. So it's 5 cars with the lights looking at the person.
It's an emasculation, a castration of a black guy.
What?
Which actually never, because Nancy was still alive when we actually did it. And we did it in a way it was first shown, the very first time it was shown at Harry Zeeman's documentary in 1977, in a tent outside on a square. So it was a big thing for her. And this image was so powerful because I wanted it, because when I first saw it, it reminded me of one painting, which was Los Tres de Mayo of Goya, the execution painting, exactly the same. And so this is where painting becomes so virulently interesting. And although maybe not in the center of the art world, it is much more power from this peripheral element. So it's really embedded in a sense.
That work has been shown later on at the LACMA and was censored. So the show was, it was censored, and they re-show it about 5 years ago because it was never showed properly. And in the Baroque, there's something I was very stuck in the show, which I would call something about yelling, a necessity to speak louder, even if it's in the dark paintings with the black, but about urgency for us, the group, and we're in time with a lot of urgencies.
I didn't really understand that.
In the show, I was quite stuck by the necessity of making works which speak loud, like Kinholz speaks loud compared to Reimann. It's something which is more about, like all the video by Pierre Huyghe, Human Mask, for example. There were a lot of heavy subject in that show.
Yes, and also Caveat Terius, which is a beautiful work, a very emotional one, because it's about Venezuela, which my wife and I, Carla, saw in 2004 in Mexico City, when it was already fucked, Venezuela. And so to show this stuffed lion with the Baroque music, and also to show this video as the entrance in the corridor, not in a secured room. which we did with Pierre Week because it needs it. But there are this was all about, of course, working on the stamina of the visitor, which is what the Baroque does. The Baroque overwhelms you. So,
I have almost a student-y technical question about painting, which I thought about with the way you were describing Caravaggio's process. Conservators now say that he basically started from a black ground and then painted on top of that. And I know the predominant mode of your paintings is to start on white canvas and build with that light. But have you ever made paintings that started with a colored ground? And
yes, exactly. There's one here, which is actually the shore painting. This was the very first time I painted everything black and then wiped out the paint with cues like ear, cue sticks, things to clean your ear, and to make these figures and then fill them back in. So I did that once. Or the aloe paintings are painted completely different. First the dark, then or also the Technicolor paint, because I couldn't do it any other way.
to make the Technicolor effect.
Yeah, to get this sort of, and this actually is quite interesting. You mentioned this because it's true. I mean, in effect, it's true. That's how the effect actually also works.
Yeah.
And which was actually very modern. I mean, I'm not criticizing that or that method. I mean, both have a different form of effectiveness. And I think the Caravaggio one is very effective in the way that it's very economic because of the way it is proposed and as an image, and how it also appears. I mean, how it is made in a sense.
And for Technicolor, you start with the black, or?
Yeah, I started with, I spared out all the white parts and then actually sort of like colored them in with the color. Like a color book, like a kid, basically. Okay. Yeah.
Do you want to add something?
Okay. Well, I was told we have very strict instructions of how long we're allowed to talk because we can't tire out the translator. So I want to make sure we're not over time. Jacqueline, are we okay? How long do we have before we take questions? All day. This has the tendency that it could get a little too specific, but I found that the way that you approached the technical effect of the paintings to produce an extremely different effect of the image very useful, like to understand, because paintings are like a thing that get made. And I feel like from your perspective, as you looked at the totality of the paintings, how you experienced that, like the way that you made paintings differently and the impact that the images themselves could have because of that difference.
The funny thing is that even when with large intervals I don't see my work, the minute I see it, maybe because I have a photographic memory, like when I read a book, I can't read it again. When I see a movie, I can't read it again, or see it again, because the very first image, the whole film falls out. Same with the painting. So I see the painting, yeah, that's where I started, that's where I ended. Mm-hmm. So it is very branded in my so sometimes it is much more about contrasts that I wrongly remember, size that I wrongly remember, or that things are actually really small. I thought they were bigger. I mean, things like that. Or I also have the point, oh, that's really bad. So that's, I also have that, of course. And, or I thought this was better, or so. Like this I mean, I can still see mistakes in a way, luckily. But I mean, so to the point that is, but the making, no. The making is evident. It's clear. It's the process is still there in a sense.
When you've translated one image through multiple versions, so it's like it's a photograph, becomes a drawing, becomes a painting, and then it becomes something like that floor in Palazzo Grassi into a mosaic or into a fresco. Do you feel like you've learned something different about the image through putting it through that process, or what is it? What happens that you're interested in there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea of the Schwarzheide in first of all the choice, which is loaded in a way, but also the coloring that actually is reminiscent of the building, which I thought was also important. So I wanted to make something that, if you look at it, like it's normal. It's not. It's like it's been there all the time. but it's not. So that's the inversion of this monumentality. But of course, by using this material, you get a completely different aspect, because you get the glittering of the marble that you see once you go up, or even on when you're downstairs. So there's already this enormous distortion. But still, the people who did it, who did a fantastic job, the Fantinis, understood the pictorial, the painterly aspect of it, and completely, together with us, decimated it into these little pieces, which I think is interesting. So, so once something appears in a different technique, it also has to adapt to this different technique. Not every image will be able to do that, for example. So you have to really try to be precise about that.
I have one question, which is the two latest painting in the show, Daughter Gang and the Penitence. When did you decide that those were they made in black, and how, because they're quite heavy, it's the door of the bunker of Hitler, and the statue without heads about a religious person, subjects about Nazism and religion, which comes quite often in the show anyway?
Yeah, well, these two paintings were actually the last paintings before I came to install the show, basically. This was to finish up the space. It could have been something else also in a way, but I made it a point that I wanted to have the most recent paintings of that point at the end. If that was the right choice or not, I don't know. But I mean, that's how it actually came about. And I mean, the Daughter Gang is also the element of a void. I mean, it's the closing off of a metal door in Berchtesgaden, so it's not the bunker of Hitler or something else, it's just a bunker. And the penitence is my lifelong standing sort of relationship with idea of religion, but in the terms of, I mean, Spain, basically. I mean, the darkness of the Spanish sort of counter-Reformation, which produced virulent imagery. Imagery that has to do with the fetishism, as also the war is a fetish in a sense. So all these things I thought that, together with the eyeballs and the hands, we took, it was a very, I mean, probably the most powerful image in that constellation. So maybe I was not correct, but anyway, that was how it came about.
I mean, I want to know all this technical stuff. I'm fascinated by fresco, first of all. And so, when you've moved, you talked about what the effect of the mosaic is like, in which you have something that's almost like a pixelation as a kind of mosaic breakdown of the image. But then when you were transforming your own images into fresco, that seems like a completely opposite transformation, but still crystalline. I
mean, I made a lot of wall paintings, which were made sometimes out of pragmatic reason, because transport was too expensive. Or I mean, I even made a whole show in France because the youngest curator in the FRAC in Clermont-Ferrand didn't have the money to do the transport. So, okay, so I'll make you a whole show with wall paintings. So that will disappear at the end. So there's a whole ephemerical oeuvre of at least 75 of these paintings. But I had never made a real fresco until I met the director of the museum in Ghent, Cathy de Zeger, who proposed me to do something lasting in the museum. And we got it as far as to take out the walls and then really do the fresco technique, which is based upon the three paintings that were already painted, which are here, the arena paintings, which is in itself based upon a mixed media work from 1978. So they went sort of full circle. And what amazed me, because I was really afraid of this, because of course you only really have 8 hours. So we have to be exceedingly prepared. So it's not like you're going to be able to mix colors. No, it has to be prepared. Which it was. We did a lot of tests. Also worked with people that restore frescoes. And And it went actually very well. I mean, it was like, I think it's something I really want to do again also. But then a bit more precise, I mean. And so because it's actually, I was afraid that once you would push the brush, you would go into the material, which is not, you can actually work it as a watercolor nearly. It's really interesting.
What do you think is the information or the visual experience that gets fed into the image through becoming a fresco that's different than you could do as an oil painting?
Well, the danger of it, the way it dries up, you never know. And this was the anxiety of it, watching it over the weeks to see. And of course, the very first one I made was on the end wall of the museum. What we didn't know is that the humidity was different on that wall than the other walls, which went in a curve. So what happened is that the pigment, because I used too much, sort of cropped itself together in little nucleuses. So I said, oh my God, fuck, it's fucked, you know, like Leonardo da Vinci would have said, it's fucked, but it's like this. And eventually I thought it was beautiful, and it stayed like that, it stabilized itself. The only problem we had, and that's what one of the technicians in the museum said it, although we worked with experts, the yellow they actually presented to us was poisonous. And the guy from the museum said, this is going to turn black, which it did. It turns black, and then it eventually evaporates. So that was the only mistake, because it's very difficult to find the colors that will persist. I mean, and yellow and red sometimes, some of those colors are very problematic, you know, to stay. But it was actually a success, and it's still now, of course, it's stabilized, so it is there, and it's in the wall, which I think is fantastic. I mean, you cannot take it out.
Yeah.
So sometimes I look at it and I think it's horrible, and sometimes I don't. But of course, yeah, I made it, so I cannot deny it, so that's a pity, maybe.
Before we do the Q&A, because I have a very strict policy that you have to go technical, conceptual question. So before we open it up, I want to just ask you about the role of belief in images.
Well, there's been a great deal of distrusting the imagery, I think. That was the main captive of, in that sense I was correct. I mean, look at the fake news. I mean, so I was visionary in that point. So in that sense, that was always there. But there was also the fascination with power and the power of the image, which is still there. I mean, imagery are mostly made for people who are illiterate, so they're on purpose. I mean, look at the stupidity the world is turned into, so it's not getting any better. So in that sense, it is actually, it's interesting, the persistence in, but it's also compulsive in a way, I think. And that belief could easily be seen as an element of superstition, but then superstition might be a bit more efficient and a bit more poignant than belief is, I think, in that way.
One work is called Superstition.
Yes.
Maybe turn to you, if some people have some questions.
Oh, yeah.
C'est déjà sur... You get a microphone.
Oh, thank you. A retrospective is a point in anyone's life where they look all the way back and look at how their work has kind of come forward as they've gone through the decades of their life. It's also something that marks time, and it also gives perspective about how much time has passed. How are you feeling about seeing this retrospective of work? Because I'm sure some of these works you haven't seen in years. It's like assembling old friends, and sometimes it's like assembling frightening ideas. But the idea of a retrospective is something that...
Well, it isn't a retrospective, that's what I said. So.
It is...
No, it isn't. I said in the beginning, it is specifically not a retrospective. It is something, and even, I mean, there was one show that was kind of linear, which I did with a tour through 4 American museums, which was perceived as a sort of coherent retrospective made by 2 female curators, which I really respect, and that's why I gave them the chance to do that. Because they also completely reconstructed 3 full gallery shows, which I think is important. So what do I feel when I see that? Well, virtually nothing. I mean, the thing is just that I never understood that people want to cry in front of paintings or become extremely flat out emotional. I think that is rather pathetic. So in that sense, I think it's important that there is this space of retrospection, as you said, the way that you can, for me, it's interesting to sometimes see something else. But this show is not a retrospective. I mean, there will be probably. I mean, and there has been, like this one I said, because that. But that's. I think it's not to me to make a retrospective. This here, it's too personal. You see what I mean? Yes. So, and for me, the thing that I liked about the show that it was also bringing me a specific pleasure, which I think is interesting. And the paintings I picked together with Caroline have a specific meaning also, of which I can say much more, but then we're going to take too much time. So, but this is not a retrospective, sorry. Yeah.
So you told us a lot about the distrust of images, about that they're not psychological, that they're dark, they're black. I was asking myself, and we had this discussion this afternoon, Jarrett, and we were both asking us, where's the humor? Is this a category in your work? Is there something which makes us laugh?
Well, it's rather sardonic, I'd say. Yeah, there is humor in the work in a very weird way, because of the absence of it too. I mean, so no, there is humor. I mean, so.
Okay.
Oh, hi. I'm appreciative of your, here, do you want me to stand? This is a very loud microphone. I'm very appreciative of the way that you hung the show, having the didactics separate, because I felt like it was an immediacy with the imagery. And then when I read what was the research and reason for the paintings, it was very impactful. So was this something that you have always done when you're showing your work? Or is this something for this show?
Well, in this case, I was unable to do what I wanted to do, and I didn't want any wall texts. I think that's disturbing, wall text, and then people will read and then look. At least here, we printed a little leaflet, which actually all the comments on the paintings were made by those 2 people, by Marc and Caroline. They wrote all the captions next to the work, for which I thank them. And so at least you have the chance to do 2 things. Either you just look and then read it, or you read and look, or you read it afterwards. What I find very important is that in this didactic age, I find it very important not to but especially not to underestimate an audience. See, I mean, that's the biggest mistake you can make, because you take away the experience. So it's not necessarily that as a person, as a spectator, you have to know where I derived it from. The very first element should be pictorial and visual. Therefore, also the show is hanging with a lot of space. So it's easy to see, because I know how people, if you would pack it full, for example, you will never have the same attention span. And of course, because of the fact that you already have this gigantic grandeur and pressure of the building, you can do that. Because you have this overload of, let's say, a ceiling painting or the marble, which in a white cube is already completely different. But so this immediately said to me, we have to make these attention points. And apparently it's to a point sort of works.
Devo fare la domanda in italiano. Mi pare di capire che la scelta dell'immagine vada di conseguenza sia a un impatto iniziale dell'immagine sia alla storiografia dell'immagine, quindi la storia che ne segue. Quanto viene mantenuto il distacco durante cioè durante la pittura? Quanto la storia dell'immagine impatta sul metodo e sul risultato pittorico?
Yeah, it's kind of confused, but because I don't know. Yeah, of course. Well, I made the one point that.
Oh, should we restate the question?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, it's quite elliptical. Might be translation, but it's about the image that you choose has a meaning or a history that is inherent in the choice, and then when you make the painting, how do you create the distance or the relationship between those two things?
Okay, is that sort of in order with you? Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's also a moral question to a point. There is an element of morality in that, and that's why I think that art is not dealing with morality.
Can you talk about the morality of your work? What role does that play? That would be great.
Well, and but yeah, true. You got me there. So, in a sense, yeah. But what the fuck? The Dutch would say it differently. You know, there are two. I'll illustrate it with an idea. I'm probably not going to answer his question, but I'll answer your question first. So, there are two parts in Holland, which is the southern part and the northern part. And the southern part is still Catholic to a great deal extent. And the one over the river is actually the real Dutch motherfuckers. And so once we had family members in the south and the northern part, so when the southern Dutch guy would go visit the northern Dutch guy and said, don't you think it's immoral? The northern Dutch guy would say, what do you mean, immoral or amoral? So that is actually the answer to the question. But anyway, what you are trying to tell me is, how do you make the detachment from what is also not only the source material, but the signifier of the image in a way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I actually, and there is one painting in this show which was predominantly interesting and important for that matter, which was because through different circumstances, first of all, autobiographical in the family, and then on a larger part, the idea of what the Second World War actually did and what the consequences were, which ran all the way to where you're sitting right now, and the idea to make art from something real instead of making art from art, which is also an important decision, which is a political decision in a sense. I mean, but the very first image that came, although after circling around it, more to the point was the Our No Quarters painting of the casemates of Theresienstadt, which was by no means a death camp. It was a camp where people were assembled and from there on sent to the different death camps, so to speak. Now, I found a book years ago in a second-hand shop of Alfred Kantor, who was a Czech Jew, who survived 3 camps and actually was liberated in the same camp, which was the point of departure, which was the Theresienstadt. I mean, Theresienstadt was in the then Czechoslovakia. But in the beginning, when he was there, the Germans dealt out, because they were actually trying to say that these camps were kind of nice and all that, dealt out postcards of this particular image of which, because it was already a military structure, and on the back they were able to write to their family like Our No Quarters, which he actually did later in 1974 when he decided not to write something down, but to make drawings of his experiences. And the very first page of that book is this postcard under which there is our new quarters in American. So it was as if there was no time span, no distance in all those years for this particular experience. So I thought that was actually an interesting point of entry to work with a taboo, the same like the gas chamber, it's a taboo. So these were very imminent. So this was pretty much the closest I can get to answering your question in a way.
Earlier you mentioned the the residue that actually interests me in reference to violence. The residue of the violence is the thing that interests you and is often the pictorial referent in your works. And I was wondering if you could speak to the physicality of the surface texture and the smoothness of the paint and how that may actualize the residue of violence.
Yeah, I think there is also a matter of fact like element of working with the idea of violence in the sense like the clinical approach of it. And in this diagnostical view portrait number 4, for example, it was the first time I started to put the paint or push the paint like horizontal over the surface to even flatten out more the imagery. I mean, so that as a viewer, you are no longer enabled to create any empathy to what is actually portrayed. I also changed the eyes, because in the real image, you will see the subject looking in the camera. Here it looks over your head, so that you don't have any point of reference anymore. And mostly, the way I paint something comes about when I know what I'm going to paint, I sort of have to figure out how I'm going to paint it too. That's an important point, the second step. And so this goes sort of hand in hand, in a way.
Dear Luc, I'm not from Antwerp, but from Ghent. So, what's the significance of your titles in this discourse? Is this a new image, or is it a distance you create?
It can be both. I mean, sometimes the title is descriptive; it just says what you're looking at, and sometimes it can be something completely different, and then it creates another image. I mean, an image that is not there, basically. It's also a little bit the same thing as I chose the title of the show. I wanted something Italian, you know, La Pelle. Also because in French it's just something you use in a garden to shuffle with, and in Italian,
Or to kill someone.
okay, fine, whatever. And but here in Italian it means the skin, and of course we have. He mentioned Tizian, Tintoretto, you have the canvas, you have the skin, and also you go under the skin. But of course I was very well aware by doing that there is really a cult book, which is also called La Pelle, which I read, of course, by Malaparte, which is Italian, of course, although from German descent. And a sort of accident, like a fluke of nature in history, in a sense also, which rather megalomaniac, which I thought was yet again another reminiscence, and also this Malaparte and came up also because I saw the Le Mépris, which we showed here for a packed theater, on this fantastic villa that the guy made on this cliff in Capri, in which you can actually then see Brigitte Bardot understand zilch of the dialogues being completely moronic. And I think that's an epic movie. I mean, they will never be able to make that again. Also the end with Jack Palance, you know, between two trucks and an open car. It's fabulous. So in that sense, the titles sometimes are very deliberate and sometimes they're just not. But I did do that because when I started to show painting, nobody did titles. They always said, no, I mean, zonder titel, no title, because it was not done. It was actually seen as too descriptive or whatever. But since I've always been also interested in literature, I think words are kind of important in a sense. They also have an image in a way, I think.
Can I ask like a quick follow-up about that? Sorry, I've got thoughts. The question of the language that you provide to the work and the interpretive frame that you constructed around it, as someone writing about your work, that is the biggest confrontation, is that like your collected interviews, your kind of intellectual theoretical essays are so smart, and they fit so tightly against the paintings that I feel like it has guided the hand quite firmly of how people discuss the work. And I wonder like if you regret that or like how you feel like that could be changed.
Well, I think you're completely right. I'm a bit of a control freak. And
you?
Yeah, I am. And so in that sense, because I mean, that's part of the way I was raised. My mother used to say, it's going very well, but in 30 seconds it can go all to smithereens. So maybe that's what played out. I mean, so better be prepared than sorry, I'd say. So, but it's true. There is then also, of course, you don't create the openness. But then still again, and there's also maybe the wrong competitive sort of abuse that you place on things. But on the other hand, I still think it's possible. I mean, it's just why not? I mean, and I'm very curious to see what will happen. I mean, the one thing, of course, what I do is make this catalogue raisonné, but also sort of make sure that there is a lot of material of how the work was installed, because when I'm no longer there, I mean, so in that sense there are all these derogatives, but of course they can hang it upside down when I'm dead. Why not? I mean, so
we'll see how that goes.
I think maybe in 20 years people will reinvent Impressionism because they will have forgotten all about it. I mean, that can...
Dunque, se non ci sono altre domande, in chiusura di questa serata, per la quale ringrazio di nuovo Luc Tuymans, Jarrett, Earnest, Marc Donnadieu e Caroline Bourgeois, permettetemi un ultimo ringraziamento a Vanessa Van Obergen, grazie mille dello studio Tuymans, perché senza di te sarebbe stato tutto molto più difficile, invece così è stato facilissimo. Grazie a tutti, buona serata. Grazie.